and welcome to today's South Talk. My name is Ellie Palazzolo. I joined the Center for the Study of Southern Culture this fall as Southern Foodways Alliance Assistant Professor of Southern Studies and Assistant Professor of History. Today, I'm here to cue you in on a few upcoming South Talks, and most importantly, to welcome our speaker, Becky Marchiel. For the devotees, this week has brought 3 South Talks, yesterday's, this one, and one more. At noon on Friday, Professor Eric Solomon will be in conversation with Dr. Martin Paget about Paget's new book, The Many Passions of Michael Hardwick, Sex in the Supreme Court in the Age of AIDS. This is a work of history and biography about the Atlanta man who unexpectedly became a face of the gay rights movement in the 1980s. In The Many Passions of Michael Hardwick, Paget assembles the complete kaleidoscope of Hardwick's life, connecting the lessons of his moment with our own. Next week, we'll convene again at noon on Wednesday for Dr. Byron DeAndrea Ori's South Talk, the book Mississippi Tried to Ban 50 Years Later. Professor DeAndrea Ori will join us from Jackson State University, where he is Professor of Political Science, in order to discuss his work on Mississippi, Conflict and Change. This is a textbook originally published in 1974 that explored a broad swath of Mississippi history and was remarkable for its nuanced and evidence-based depictions of slavery, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the civil rights movement in the state. Long out of print, DeAndrea Ori and the late James W. Lowen have developed a new, updated, and accessible edition of Mississippi Conflict and Change, which you can learn more about on October 29th. Now it's a great delight to introduce Dr. Becky Marchiel. Becky Marchiel is an Associate Professor of History here at the University of Mississippi, where she researches urban history and political economy in the United States. Her first book, AfterRedlining, The Urban Reinvestment Movement in the Era of Financial Deregulation, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2020. Her work has also appeared in the Mississippi Free Press and the Washington Post. In 2015, Becky was the recipient of a fellowship from Harvard's Charles Warren Center. This South Talk, The Park That Was a Prison, Reading the Landscape in Late 20th Century Memphis, is based on research for a set of articles she is writing on urban redevelopment in Memphis in the late 20th century. Professor Marchiel.
Thank you, Ellie, for that kind introduction. Everyone can hear me. Well, thank you all for coming today, and thank you especially to Dr. Afton Thomas for the invitation to present. I was excited to learn that the theme for South Talks this year is Reading the South, because as Ellie just said, I've been working on a set of articles about efforts to revitalize Memphis in the late 1960s through the 1980s. So the research I'll share today is about reading competing visions for Memphis's landscape during this period. For context, during the 1960s and the 1970s, the city had a particular challenge in front of it: how to chart a viable path forward to become a vibrant, thriving city when the city's reputation had been so damaged after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968. And that question unfolded in a larger context, a longer-standing issue, which was that city leaders talked about Memphis as a second-rate city, right? One that didn't have the ability to draw tourists with attractions like the Grand Ole Opry or the French Quarter, and it also didn't have the kind of economic base that would draw upper-income residents to the city center for work. So this topic, Reading the South, lent itself well to one of the stories that I'm reconstructing in my research right now, and that's the story of the development of Shelby Farms from a prison into a park. And I'm particularly excited to talk about this project now because, to be honest, I'm still figuring out the framing. I have a handle on what happened, but I'm using this opportunity to talk with y'all to try to figure out why I think it matters. So I'll be really interested to hear what resonates, what you want to know more about, and ideas you have about where I can push my analysis further. So first, how many people have been to Shelby Farms? Okay, so we have like a point of reference, right, for folks in the room. Shelby Farms is a 4,500 acre park, right, an enormous urban park on the east side of Memphis. For a sense of scale, Central Park in New York City is 843 acres, so this is 4,500. Shelby Farms has over 40 miles of trails, over 20 bodies of water, a splash pad, a playground, a herd of buffalo, which I'm still trying to figure out why those are there, horseback riding, a ropes course, an enormous dog park, and a $5 million annual operating budget. Huge park. As the title of my talk suggests, Shelby Farms had not always been a giant urban park. For half of the 20th century, from the late 20s through the 1970s, it had functioned as a penal farm, right? A county penitentiary where mostly minor offenders would come and labor for the county, doing agriculture work on the farm or being sent to repair or lay city roads. There was nothing inevitable about the transition of the penal farm to a park. So I became curious about this story. Who had the power to shape the way the landscape would change? What were the contested visions for the land? And how might piecing together this particular story illuminate larger questions that historians and other humanists have about land use and the public good? So today I'm going to sketch out two different visions for the landscape that Memphians and land use experts around the country had for the penal farm. One in which the penal farm land would become a new town, and the other in which it would become a park. And we know where this story is going. But this story also has national implications for urban planning history. What's important to understand here is that conversations about land use in the South during this moment were particularly fruitful. Urban planners and landscape architects were interested in the South because cities in the Northeast, like Boston, New York, what have you, cities in the Midwest, like Chicago, Cincinnati, etc., these cities had already been built up by the late 19th century. Their suburbs had been built up too. Undeveloped land was further outside the metropolis and could hardly be thought of as part of the city. The questions of land use in these places had to do with revitalization. Urban planners had to consider what had already been built, what had already been zoned. The framework was about rehabilitating buildings, demolition and replacement, infill housing, all these strategies that recognized the land had already been transformed into property and developed. But in a place like Memphis, in contrast, there was much more undeveloped space close to the center city. The penal farm land, 4,500 continuous acres, planners looked at as raw land. They used the language raw land, blank slate, pure land, right? The kind of opportunity that would have been unimaginable near a city like Boston. People who had big visions about land use could play, could experiment, could propose big visions that would not have been feasible in the Frost Belt. So we can learn a lot about late 20th century ideas about how people should interact with the land and what folks meant about the public good by exploring these visions. So that's where I'm going. To start, I wanted to just talk a little bit about where the penal farm comes from, right? So southern states and counties established penal farms in the late 19th, early 20th century. In Tennessee, in 1928, the state witnessed the collapse of the convict lease system. That timing is important, right? This was a system where the state rented out imprisoned people, mostly Black Americans, to private businesses for forced labor, generating profit for the state while subjecting prisoners to brutal exploitative conditions. In Shelby Farms, right, in Shelby County, the penal farm was an alternative, right? It was created in 1929, so just a year after the collapse of convict leasing. And it kept incarcerated folks working on state projects, but instead they did grueling agricultural work on the farm itself or roads nearby. In some cases around the region, right, like Mississippi's notorious Parchment Farm, the penal farm really resembled antebellum slavery, right? Parchment was literally built on a former plantation, and it resembled its labor system as well, right? A prison for Black men where they grew and harvested cotton under brutal, inhumane conditions. Shelby Farms was supposed to be different, right? In the late 1920s, to prepare for its construction, the chair of the county court, whose name was E.H. Hale, this guy up here, he traveled around the country studying what he called the latest and best methods in modern carceral institutions. He wanted the farm in Shelby County to stand apart from places like Parchment. Instead of cotton, he envisioned what he called a demonstration farm for what he called a new economy on the horizon of Southern agriculture. Shelby Farms would use mechanized equipment. It would raise livestock like hogs, cattle, and mules. It would experiment with diversified crops. Hale promoted this as a solution to the one-crop system and its evils that was unfolding in places like Parchment. So in other words, Shelby Farms was meant to body both modern punishment and modern agriculture. Promotional materials described it as an example of technological efficiency with the soundest kind of farming that builds up the land rather than erodes it. Visitors were invited to tour what officials called a demonstration of good management of human, soil, water, and livestock resources. Hale imagined not just a prison, but a showpiece, right? A showpiece for the New South, a place where discipline, productivity, and progress would all be on display. From the 1920s to the 1960s or so, when the penal farm was operating at its peak, Shelby Farms landscape also functioned in two other ways, right, beyond just being a demonstration farm. First, and probably very obviously, Shelby Farms was the site of violence and punishment. Sources here are actually pretty limited, but the evidence I found reveals that, no surprise, right, brutal conditions lay at the heart of the farm's productivity. I got a small glimpse into the conditions of the farm when I found this newspaper article about a white civil engineer who was arrested for check forgery in 1948. He served 54 days on the penal farm, and when he came out, he became an advocate for reform. He talked about rotten food, poor medical care, unsanitary conditions. He was haunted by the memory of a black octogenarian, right, some guy in his 80s who was forced to do manual labor beyond what his body could handle. 4 years after this, a group of imprisoned people actually cut their own heel tendons in an effort to draw attention to the inhumane treatment at the penal farm. Prisoners tried to escape constantly, many succeeded, and it's unknown how many incarcerated people the prison's operators worked to death or beat to death. In cases where incarcerated men died, the coroner often cited the cause of death as heart attack, even in instances like this article up here on the right, where the other part of the article clearly documents abuse of the prisoner by the prison operators. But the official county position on the farm was that it was a model institution where incarcerated people learned discipline while refining regionally specific agricultural techniques. The evidence suggests a much more violent, punitive reality. At the same time, right, so we have a demonstration farm, a site of violence, and at the same time, the penal farm was the third thing. It was a site of leisure. I found this really surprising to find in the historical records. For white Memphians who had no fear of being swept up in the carceral system, Shelby Farms was a place to spend time in nature. It was a recreational space where white folks would go on the weekends to fish, to take a walk, to go biking, to go horseback riding. There was a firing range, there were community garden plots, there was beekeeping, right? So this reality that these folks were using this space for leisure and recreation solidified the idea that many white Memphians had, that this site was also a site of outdoor recreation and leisure. This idea will obviously come to matter later in my story. So from the 1920s to the 1960s, the penal farm had been all these things: a demonstration farm, a site of violence and brutality, and also a site of leisure. Two shifts occurred in the 1960s that changed the way that Memphians thought about the penal farm. The first was, I don't have a slide of this, was civil rights activists cast a national spotlight on penal farms when organizers were arrested and sent to these places. High-profile instances like Rock Hill, South Carolina, where my colleague Dr. Graham is from, and Freedom Riders in Mississippi who were sent to Parchment, right? These shone a light on the penal farm system. These high-profile arrests made the Southern approach to crime and punishment look backwards, like a vestige of slavery, right when the eyes of the nation were on the South to interrogate its treatment of Black Americans. The second shift that occurs over the course of the 1960s is the gradual expansion of prisoners' rights. Over a series of rulings, the Supreme Court recognized that prisoners had many of the same constitutional protections as people on the outside. So these cases, these rulings, also cast a spotlight in particular on the harsh conditions at penal farms. So in this context, right, with the penal farm looking less like the crown jewel than it once had been for E.H. Hale, the Memphis Planning Commission in 1966 started to plan for the penal farm's eventual closure. It produced a report that included a dramatic reimagining. Instead of a site of carcerality, the property would become a central node of population within a growing metropolis. The planners predicted that while central Memphis was losing residents, right, downtown and its nearby neighborhoods, the eastern edge, East Memphis, was poised for a population boom. Future growth would occur in what they called a multiple centers pattern, and you can see this image up here of this representation. The idea was that density would be clustered around several spots rather than in downtown alone. The penal farm land offered a unique opportunity for planned urban expansion, right? It was large enough to constitute a big new center, and it was the logical extension of the city's eastward growth. This moment, right, the idea that this could be a new population center, also overlapped with an emerging new town movement in planning circles through the 1960s and 1970s. Planners were frustrated with urban renewal, right, the process that had displaced thousands in central cities as land had been sort of cleared as slums. Planners were also frustrated with what they saw as unchecked suburban sprawl. And so in this moment, a lot of planners are thinking about a middle path. Communities built from scratch, carefully designed to balance housing, jobs, and green space. These folks were inspired by British precedents, right? American Newtown planners. They thought you could include commercial and industrial zones to ensure economic self-sufficiency. They envisioned efficiency, the idea if you built this new town all at the same time, right? Building at scale would lower construction costs. They were also deeply committed to social inclusivity. They recognized the way that suburbs that had been developed by private developers had excluded a lot of Americans, like along the lines of race, for instance, and also along the lines of class. So the vision was there would be housing for low-income residents who had often missed out on the suburbs. And while advocates claimed moral and environmental motives, they also saw profit potential. As one Newtown enthusiast put it, this wasn't the business of, quote, bleeding heart do-gooders. Instead, the Newtown concept was, quote, pure capitalistic entrepreneurship, right? So these were towns that could also make some money. So with city planners calling for a new town on the penal farmland, Jim Rouse enters the picture. Jim Rouse was the country's premier builder of new towns. He was best known for Columbia, Maryland, which I'll talk about in a second. He had started his career as a banker in Baltimore. By the 1950s, he moved into shopping mall development, in part because he saw shopping malls as the future of community life, right? If social fabric was going to be built up in America, it was going to be happening in the shopping malls, this optimistic vision. By the 1960s, he had become very critical of suburban sprawl. He called it a crime against the human spirit. He said suburbs were growing by sheer chance, by whim of the private developer, and it was producing formless places without order, beauty, or reason. So for him, sprawl wasn't just ugly, it wasted land and it eroded community. Columbia, Maryland became his model alternative. As one historian put it, Columbia really set the terms of the debate around sprawl in the 1960s. Built on 15,000 acres between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and starting in 1966, Columbia mixed social experimentation with innovative financing. Rouse's vision drew on small-town nostalgia. He wanted walkable neighborhoods, daily interactions that built a sense of belonging. For each contained village that he built in Columbia, there would be a school, a park, a daycare center, shops, a swimming pool. The town center would be in between all the villages, and folks from the villages would come together for work and culture. That's where the museums and the concerts would happen. Rouse imagined Columbia as a complete and self-sustaining community. And importantly, he wanted to replicate it elsewhere. Right? In a 1972 interview with the Baltimore Sun, he said he planned to build 7 little Columbias around the country. And here is where Jim Rouse comes to Memphis. Let's see. Okay. So Jim Rouse came to Memphis in 1973 at the invitation of the local government. He promised nothing short of a revolution in city planning. Standing on the expanse of the penal farm land, he told Memphians that this would be the best opportunity in the country for a new planned community. And he was thrilled by what he saw. It's really rare, he told reporters, to find 4,500 acres of undeveloped land in one place, under single ownership, and within close range of a major city. So you can see, right, the sort of shape with all of the diagonal lines up there, like that's Shelby Farms, and just see how proximate it is to all the yellow, right, just to its west, like that is residential development. So it's getting really close to that property line. So again, that point that this land is really close to where the city's boundaries already lie. Rouse framed the project as both a civic mission and a business venture. The new town, he promised, would increase Memphis's tax base by an estimated $220 million. His enthusiasm reflected his philosophy of land use, that proper planning could produce rational, walkable communities, orderly, efficient, and humane. His team's report to Shelby County elaborated on that vision, describing that the total community environment of a new town would improve residents' lives through integrated design and through shared spaces. After 6 months of discussion, Rouse submitted a plan to purchase about half of the property. The remaining land would stay under the control of the county for recreational use, which is important to think about, right? There's gonna be opposition, it's coming, but only half of the land was gonna turn into this new town. The new plan envisioned a population of about 25,000 residents with a broad range of housing to attract different income groups. And here is the moment where I thought, okay, when I proposed this talk to AFNA, I was like, I wanna talk about this stuff. I was gonna show everybody the Rouse plan for Memphis so we could read the landscape together. However, in the document, he has this image over here where you can see he's divided the land just into what he calls prime lowland or prime orientation rolling land. Like prime is the only category of land here, right? So it's not a very detailed plan. There's a lot of rich description in the plan that he sent to the city and the county, but there aren't a lot of drawings, right? We can't really read the landscape here. What he does share with the county and the city, however, are his drawings of Columbia, right? So as I was reading this source, I think that there's something going on where Jim Rouse thinks that he can point to his success in Columbia, and that will give him enough traction to be able to do this project in Shelby County. And he doesn't seem to actually take the time to draw a sketch of like what this planned community would look like in Memphis. Curious what people think about that when we get to the question and answer. So Ross's proposal, right, it promised modern order, fiscal benefits, civic pride, all the hallmarks of post-war planning optimism. And for a city struggling to show that it was indeed a first-rate city, the idea of a rationally designed, self-contained community built by the nation's preeminent new town planner seemed like a bold new start. But here we have a plot twist. Just as the contract between the Rouse team and the county seemed nearly finalized, a group of Memphians stepped in to stop the deal. In the summer of 1973, an unlikely coalition of environmentalists and business leaders came together in opposition of the new town. One of them was John Virgos, who's pictured up here. His dad is named Charles, which is why he's under that sign. Anyway, so he was a law student, right? And he remembered driving through the penal farm on school field trips and being struck by the land's beauty. To him, it was a natural resource that needed to be preserved and not developed. The opposition also included residents who thought Memphis needed to focus on improving what already existed, not building an entirely new town. One attorney captured this view. He said, quote, "We know we're going to need a great deal of land for public use in the future, maybe for a park, maybe a sports facility, or for public buildings. If we keep it, we've got options. If we sell it to Rouse, we're done for." At the same time, local developers began voicing their own objections. Many were supremely frustrated that Rouse, this out-of-town developer, had struck a tentative deal with Memphis before any locals were given a chance to bid on the property. So soon, a counter-movement of these Rouse opponents cohered around the slogan of penal farm for the public use. The push to preserve Shelby Farms as public land reflected a broader preoccupation among Memphis's white civic elite with creating a sense of world-class leisure in a city often dismissed as second-rate. Local attorney and reformer, Boss Crump opponent, Lucius Birch, gave voice to this anxiety. He said, quote, "You wouldn't want your worst enemy to come to this town. There is nothing in this city to give life and joy." He lamented that nearby places like Nashville had its new Opryland attraction, and this, in his understanding, gave, quote, class to a city. But Memphis lacked a comparable jewel, and Rouse's new town, he warned, would become, quote, just another subdivision, right? The idea that it sounds like a new town, it sounds great, but once the rubber hits the road, what are we actually looking at? Isn't this just a new suburban development? The civic frustration led into a new vision, right? That Shelby Farms could be something extraordinary, a space that would elevate Memphis's image. A local planning memo put it this way: attractions, which are internationally famous, such as the Bellingroth Gardens, the Butch Art Gardens, San Diego Zoo, Golden Gate Cultural Center, and Opryland, all furnish ideas and inspiration for those who want to save the land for the public. Can't we do something similar here, is the idea. One advocate challenged city leaders directly when one of them said that Memphis hadn't been able to pull off large-scale projects in the past. "We don't have the thinking and leadership that has made such things possible in San Diego and San Francisco," he said, "but isn't it time we tried to change?" Shelby Farms had become more than just land, right? It had become a symbol. Whether one wanted to build a new town or an internationally famous attraction, everyone agreed that the site represented Memphis's best chance to prove that it could think and plan on a grand scale. The debate over Shelby Farms reached its boiling point in the summer of 1973. The local government called a public hearing in July to review the Rouse plan. And for nearly 3 hours, opposing visions for the land were on full display. Opponents of the sale dominated the meeting. More than 300 people crowded into an auditorium. Someone hung a huge green and white sign across a wall that read, "Once it's sold, it's gone forever." John Burgos arrived with what he claimed were 12,000 signatures against the new town and promised he could deliver 60,000 more before the official vote was going to come up. Prominent local developers voiced their objections, mostly about money and process. One argued that the city had undervalued the land in its dealings with Rouse. From the summer through the fall, the future of the penal farm dominated local conversation. The coalition that formed around the public use cause built its case on both morality and modern land use policy. Many citizens embraced a new vocabulary of conservation and anti-sprawl planning. A public park, they insisted, would serve the public good in a way that a private new town never could. Letters poured into local newspapers. One writer called the proposed sale a land grab, arguing that Rouse's group, quote, hoped to make millions at the expense of all Shelby County residents who are the true owners of this property. By early fall of 1973, the new town plan was all but dead. County officials postponed a vote. At that point, Rouse pulled out of the project before it was taken from him. He said that negotiations had dragged on for too long, and in the current environment, we can only anticipate further delay and strife. As a parting shot, Rouse warned county leaders not to waste time on, quote, unrealistic and grandiose schemes like building a park that could rival Central Park, a goal he implied that was far beyond Memphis's reach. So in short, the momentum, the moral argument about how human beings should interact with the land, they had all shifted decisively toward those demanding that Shelby Farms remain in public hands. Once Memphis officials agreed to repurpose the penal farm for public use, they faced a deeper question. What counted as public use and who should decide? The county created a new development authority, the Shelby Farms Planning Board, which I'll just call the Planning Board, to figure it out. In its first meetings, the discourse of public use loomed large. The new planning board wrestled with how much public participation to invite versus how much to defer to professional planners. One member said their task should be to hire the best qualified planner, but ensure there was maximum input from the public. So soon after, the board chose Garrett Ekbo to design the master plan for a new Shelby Farms. Garrett Ekbo was a San Francisco landscape architect. Like Jim Rouse, he had made a national name for himself as an innovator. His expertise in landscape architecture and environmental planning, rather than commercial development, positioned him differently to approach this project. By the early 1970s, he was described as the father of modern landscape architecture. In his 1950 book, Landscape for Living, Ekbo criticized the kind of large-scale development that Rouse had just tried to build at Shelby Farms. Land use planning, he said, had become, quote, the most practical, least aesthetic, and most politic of the arts. But one day he hoped it could become, quote, a major creative vehicle for the good of society. Ekbo's ideas about open space became even clearer in his mid-60s writings. He said, quote, urban structural systems obliterate the basic topography and the vegetation of nature. Man began as part of these wild free spaces, but 10,000 years later, the spread of urbanism has destroyed natural sites and open space so completely that it has become vastly difficult to recapture. By the time he put in his name to design Shelby Farms, Ekbo was teaching at UC Berkeley and had published 6 books laying out this philosophy. At the core of his thinking was the belief that thoughtful landscape design, attentive to art, ecology, and human experience, could serve the public good. This reflected a broader shift in planning, one that competed with the new town vision, right? Open space preservation had moved to the center of planning practice, justified not just by aesthetics, but by what one scholar has called an ecosystem rationale. By that I mean, right, the idea that open space performed essential ecological functions that sustained life itself. This new perspective rejected the idea that humans should dominate nature, right? It instead emphasized respect for nature's capacity to support both human and non-human life. So in that context, preserving undeveloped land as park space was not just sentimental, it was proper land use at last. So back to this idea of public use. To a city that was reeling from the failed Rouse project, Ekbo's proposal offered a striking alternative. Instead of another master plan city, he promised to take his cues from the public. He pledged to get maximum involvement from local citizens. And tellingly, his first proposal to the planning board opened not with blueprints and not with cost projections, but with two subjects: the land and the people. And then he waxed philosophically about both. But this framing, putting the relationship between people and the land at the center, was exactly what the Shelby Farms Park Board wanted to hear. And actually one of them, like on this little memo where the proposal came in, you can see it in handwriting, which I couldn't find for the slide, but it just said, like, is this just good salesmanship? This is too good to be true. Like, they were aware of the ways in which he was really selling it. But even as Ekbo signed his contract, this is foreshadowing. The county chairman circulated a letter to the planning board warning of deep fiscal strains in Memphis. This year presents probably the most intense fiscal challenge ever faced by local governments, he said, facing the same kind of white flight and deindustrialization, job flight that other 1970s cities were also experiencing. So the board started to be worried that without outside funding, this plan might never be implemented. This is foreshadowing. Okay. So, in any case, with this emphasis on public use, Ekbo wanted public input. He held 4 workshops in early 1975, which drew mostly white middle-class residents who overwhelmingly supported a park that was going to be designed by a world-renowned landscape architect. Ekbo, however, was troubled by the lack of Black participation. He noted the absence of residents from neighborhoods like Whitehaven, Westwood, Lemoyne, Owen, and Fraser, Raleigh, all Black neighborhoods in the city. To address this, his team held 3 satellite workshops to understand what public use, public good meant in those places. And these sessions revealed sharp skepticism toward the project. Many Black Memphians questioned devoting public funds to what they saw as a luxury park, while downtown declined and basic urban needs went unmet. Participants described the plan as, quote, for white folks, and they called for greater inclusion of affordable housing. One asked why public use could not mean public housing. One simply said, do nothing with the land. Efforts need to be concentrated downtown. Ultimately, the Citizens Workshop exposed deep divisions about what public use meant and which public the Shelby Farms plan was meant to serve. Nonetheless, the Ekbo plan was approved in late 1975, right? And you can see just the extent to which, right, the sort of natural features are here as opposed to the Columbia plan, which was really focused on residential development, where's the commerce, et cetera, right? This is going to be a park. It included a wildlife park, an arboretum, an ecology education and interpretation center, and dozens of miles of trails. To his credit, Ekbo took the lessons seriously that he learned in the satellite workshops, and he left open the possibility for the local government to decide that maybe affordable housing be built in a corner of the land. But it didn't matter too much, because the Ekbo plan was, spoiler alert, never fully funded. The local government, ever concerned about its second-rate status, lacked the resources to realize Ekbo's vision. Only fragments were built over the next 3 decades, right? A small recreation space, Plow Park, which was developed to honor the philanthropist who helped stop the new town. But the larger park imagined by Ekbo, the one that would balance ecology, community, and art, remained mostly on paper. The land was officially open to the public for recreation, right? As you can see here, this is a 1980 advertisement telling folks to come and enjoy the park. But some folks reported they didn't know what to do there, right? Without the kind of development that Ekbo had envisioned, it was still just kind of this open land. At 5 years out, one commissioner in charge of putting together the piecemeal implementation of Ekbo's plan said, quote, a good analogy would be giving 11 people brick and mortar and telling them to build a stadium. We need a little more than what we have now to do what we're supposed to do. The Ekbo plan nonetheless guided the gradual development and transformation of the land over the next 3 decades. An architect of the 2008 plan, which created the park we know today, if you've been there, he explained that his new plan wanted to combine land preservation with modern sculptural amenities that updated Southern typologies like barns and big porches. I do think that his attention to the interplay between art, ecology, and human experience would have resonated with Ekbo, even if Ekbo's comprehensive plan wasn't put into place. So what to make of this story, right? I propose two answers. First, the contest over Shelby Farms' future is an invitation for a larger systemic analysis of what happened to penal farm land in the South in the late 20th century. Historians of the carceral state have helped us understand the development of American policing, inside-outside organizing, the role of surveillance. Studies of carceral landscapes in particular have given us rich analyses of how prisons have used design choices to harness power, to deploy violence, how the location of prisons impacted the ability of incarcerated people to access resources like visitors or rehabilitation services. But I think there's a question worth asking about land use after the golden era for penal farms had passed. The dispossession of penal farm land was a massive shift in the southern carceral landscape, one that counterintuitively coincided with the rise of mass incarceration. So I have questions, right? Like, was the story of Shelby Farms common? Was it unique? What can we learn about how different communities around the South chose to repurpose their land and change their prisons during this period? I was really trying to find like another case study to start to answer this question a little bit, and I found this example from Atlanta, wherein a local historical society did a study on the history of this penal farm. And you can see this property has been abandoned, right? But the historical society is calling for some kind of public history initiative that would explore the role of incarceration in Georgia. Who benefited, who was harmed, and using this site as an interpretive landscape to invite people in the community to grapple with the legacy of penal farms. It's important to note that in contrast to this historical center in Atlanta, neither proponents of the Newtown Plan or of the park seem to grapple with what it meant to remake this area of the county that had long been the site of confinement and violence. As residents the folks who are interested in these two different plans, right, no one really paid much attention to its past. This had been a site where mostly white agents of the state had meted out punishment and violence on mostly black prisoners, while reducing the cost of Shelby County's roads and infrastructures by using prison labor on the cheap. ECBO at one point suggested that it might be a good idea to commemorate the innovative demonstration farm, right? But no one went so far as to think about what it meant that this was a site of carcerality. I expect that's because the white residents and government officials with power to decide the land's future saw nothing particularly noteworthy about the presence of the penal farm, right? This was a common feature of southern landscapes, but I'm curious, right, about the extent to which this looks similar or different from other closures of penal farms. My second parting shot here is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Shelby Farm story gives us an opportunity to explore how competing visions for undeveloped land reveal contested meanings of the public good, public use. The Rouse team and some Black Memphians at ECBO's hearings, they saw the investment in housing and humane communities as a particular vision of the public good. But those who wanted the land to become a park had different ideas, right? For them, the land served the public good only when everyone had equal access to use that land, to visit the land, to enjoy recreation there. Accordingly, they saw the new town concept as a benefit only to the people who would live on the site. It was outside of their worldview to imagine that Memphis itself would have benefited when some of its residents could gain new access to affordable housing, to good schools, and humane urban design. With that, I will thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions and comments.